Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I want to talk about problematic books and problematic authors. And this video is very much just going to be my opinions and thoughts on this, and the reason why I want to kind of put this disclaimer or stress that point isn't because I feel like I don't want to offend anyone, but just because, in my opinion, this topic, the way I see it, is very much one of those topics where there isn't really a right answer. There are plenty of definitely wrong answers, but I don't think there is one or even two or even three definitely right answers. This is the way you should deal with problematic content in books and problematic authors. So having that out of the way, let me give you a quick overview over what I will talk about in this video. First, I do want to very quickly talk about JK Rowling, her transphobic essay, and also Harry Potter in general. I want to talk about it because while I have been meaning to make this type of video talking about problematic contents in books for a longer time, JK Rowling and her essay and the reaction of the community to this essay is what finally now made me sit down and do this video. So I do feel it's important to talk about it, and I also want to talk about Harry Potter in specifics because in my opinion Harry Potter does have a kind of special place in the book community, in the fandom community. And then going on to the parts that would have been part of this video no matter when I would have made them. First, I want to talk about dealing with problematic content in books on a personal level. So if you're a private person, if you're just a reader, and my thoughts on that. I also want to talk a little bit about the reaction to problematic content in the booktranet community and my thoughts on that. And then lastly, I also want to talk a bit about the creator level, about us as creators, as influencers, if you want to call us that, us as reviewers, us as people who recommend books to other people, what in my opinion our responsibilities are when dealing with problematic books. And then kind of sprinkled throughout it are going to be some thoughts on what I think problematic books actually are, what makes a book problematic. But first, let's talk about JK Rowling. The reason why I want to talk about it is that I just want to mention that I found her essay incredibly dangerous. And the reason for that is that she very much used academic language, but in connection with using half-truths and kind of twisted truths to make her point seem clear. And so if you're not either very familiar with the discourse around trans rights, or if you're not familiar and have read a lot of works of academia, it can be very easy to read that essay and just kind of nod along and seem like, yeah, this seems reasonable. And that's why I think that actually J.K. Rowling's and also other people using similar language as her can be much more dangerous to the rights of LGBT, of trans people, than straight up bigots who go out there and say, yeah, I think trans people don't exist and are shit. Which J.K. Rowling still does, but she just does it in a way where, again, if you're not familiar with the material that already exists, with the discourse that already exists, it can be very easy to be kind of misled. And so that's also one of the reasons why I find it so important that you go out there and educate yourself. And with that, I do not mean that you should go up to trans people, same as with Black Lives Matter. You should not go up to a marginalized and hurt community and demand from them that they should educate you. But I also think that it's important to go those people, but in the way that a lot of those people have gone through the work. They have done the emotional labor. They have gone out of the way and subjected themselves to, frankly speaking, hurtful and violent language to make videos, to write articles, to help educate people who are too lazy to do the work themselves. And honestly, I do not blame anyone for not being educated, but I would blame you if you still don't go and educate yourself. And I know that even after watching videos, after reading articles, there might still be some questions open for people who want to do more to educate themselves. And so I want to just offer to those people that I have made myself familiar with discourse. I am not someone who can talk from experience, but I still want to offer the chance. If there are specific questions, you can come into my DMs on Twitter and I will try to help you either find resources that help you answer those questions, or I will answer to you from my knowledge, from what I have done to educate myself as someone who also studies cultural and social anthropology. So it is part of my curriculum at uni. And I will also leave 2 videos by an amazing transgender woman that I have found, who has gone through the work of going through the essay, who has subjected herself to the hurt to help educate other peoples. And the channel name is Jessie Gender. She has a bunch of amazing videos on transgender topics, and I will specifically leave the 2 videos that she did on JK Rowling's tweets, as well as the essay down below. So go and check that out. And I hope I didn't forget to mention anything on that part. So now that's that on the JK Rowling situation, and now moving on to Harry Potter in general, because I do think that it deserves a special spotlight, not because of JK Rowling and because the situation is very much focused on Harry Potter right now, but because in my opinion Harry Potter, even within the discourse of problematic books and problematic authors, has a very kind of specific status. And the reason why I think that is that in the case of Harry Potter, I do really think that the argument works that Harry Potter is so much more than the author. And that is because Harry Potter very much shaped our understanding today what fandom is, what fandom communities are. And I think with Harry Potter specifically, Harry Potter has gotten so much more than the original books and even the original movies. You have this whole community that creates fan art, that creates fan fiction, that has come together to support each other. And I think it's really hard to just say Harry Potter is JK Rowling or Harry Potter is not JK Rowling. And that's something that I find really interesting. And so I haven't myself even yet completely figured out what I want to do with my books and so on. I have personally decided I'm for now going to keep my books. I might finish my reread of the Harry Potter series at some point. Some of you might know that I never actually finished the series. I have never read books 6 and 7. And I'm not sure if I want to finish the series at this point or if I don't want to do it. But the thing that I've also decided for myself is that if I ever finish the series, you won't know about it. And that's not because I'm scared of any backlash, that I'm still reading Harry Potter even after JK Rowling was 100 times proven to be a TERF and a bigoted person, but because I just don't want to give any platform to JK Rowling. And I'm not someone who's in the Harry Potter community. It's not a community that's important to me, and so I don't have any issues of completely separating myself from the fandom of Harry Potter as well. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on Harry Potter that are very, very open-ended. And yeah, it's just something that I find personally really hard in that specific instance, and why I think Harry Potter kind of is a little bit outside of the usual discussion of problematic books and problematic content. So now let's get into the actual content of the video, although it's probably already a third of the video over. But I want to start with asking the question of what is a problematic book. And personally, I'm not sure that such a thing as the problematic book exists. Or if they do, they're very, very few. And I do certainly think that problematic content and highly problematic content in books exist. However, I do not even think that problematic content is always like a black and white thing. I do think that there's a very big gray gradient between the one end and the other, and it very much is up to us a lot of times to decide where on this gradient content or a book falls. For example, and I have 2 examples, one where I have heard that this book is problematic and I listen to those people, but for me personally, the way I read the book, I don't see it as problematic. And on the other end, I also have a book where I personally find the content problematic and I find the framing of something problematic, but I've also seen a lot of people who have no issue with it. One of those books is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I have talked about this book a lot on my channel already, and that I personally find the ending with the framing of a lot of the story in other places in the book problematic. I have actually made 2 videos on this. One was very much an emotional rant, and the second one I uploaded a few weeks ago, where I kind of went back a year after I read this book and more calmly explained my problems with this book. I have been told a lot of times that people don't see why I think this book is problematic. And I don't think that just because a lot of people do not see this book as problematic makes my kind of reading of this book any less valid. But I also don't think that people who do not think this book is problematic don't have points as well. It sometimes just comes down to point of view. Then on the other hand, a book that I have heard people say they think is problematic, but I personally do not read it as that, is Written in Red, or the other series by Anne Bishop. Anne Bishop is of course one of my favorite authors of all time. And the reason why so many people think this is problematic is because they think this romanticizes self-harm. The reason for that is that the main character is a Cassandra Song, and what they are is they are prophets. They can see the future if they cut themselves deep enough that it leaves a scar. However, a lot of Cassandra Song become addicted to cutting until they kill themselves, because if they cut themselves and they talk the prophecy out loud, with it comes a kind of euphoric feeling. However, if they don't talk, if they keep silent, the cutting and the prophecy is extremely, extremely painful. And so because of that euphoric feeling connected with the cutting, because of the story of like getting addicted to cutting, that's the reason why some people see it as romanticizing self-harm. However, in my opinion, there's a lot more layers to the situation of the main character, who is in danger of getting addicted to cutting, of getting addicted to that euphoria, where you just constantly have that discussion between her and other characters, also of kind of self-actualization of the character. Is it allowed that other characters need to keep her from cutting to keep her safe? Shouldn't they do that? Should they do that? Is it more important that she herself makes the decision to not cut, and so on? And so that is why I personally, while I can see why people think it's problematic, I do not see it as problematic. And by the way, I'm talking a lot more in depth about this because this doesn't really have any spoilers talking about why I think this is problematic, while this does because it's completely connected to the ending, but it's also connected to like the framing of the evil guys in this book, and also kind of the connection to like using history in a fantasy book, in my opinion. But like, if you're not bothered about spoilers, you can go ahead and watch my videos on this book as well. So yeah, that's just 2 examples why I personally think that it's not very clear-cut always if something is problematic or not. And that is why it's incredibly important, in my opinion, to listen to people when they say something is problematic, and listen to all the arguments you have. Because, frankly speaking, a lot of times, if something is not connected to our own experience with something, for example, Written in Red, the others, cutting, I have never experienced self-harm. So if people who have experienced self-harm read this book and think it's problematic, then it's incredibly important to me to listen to those people and listen to why they think it's problematic. I have actually reread this book after I heard that. I have been incredibly careful on like reading the language used, but I still came to a different conclusion than them. But not in a way where I think their opinion, again, is any less valid. Because that's the most important thing when it comes to problematic books, in my opinion. Listening to the marginalized people when they tell you that something is problematic. I, as a white person, am much less attuned to, for example, racism in books. When it comes to kind of the way a character is described or the framing of a character or anything like that. However, I as a cancer survivor am incredibly sensitive when it comes to depiction of cancer in books or other terminal illnesses. And it's something where I kind of get, I don't want to say triggered, because for me personally it's not triggered, but some people of course can very easily be triggered, and I do mean it in the proper sense of the word. I don't mean it in the social media sense of the word. But I much more easily react to not very well done cancer situations in books, for example. And so I do not think that it's a problem when you don't right away notice something is racist, ableist, homophobic, transphobic, all the phobics and ists. But I do think, again, that it's very important that we listen to people. And now, even though, again, this video has gone on a very long time already, I will come to my first point of talking about how we should deal with problematic content in books as private people. Because I do think that it's very, very much up to us. I don't think that you're automatically a racist, homophobe, etc. when you enjoy a book and when a book means a lot to you that might have some content in it that can be racist, homophobic, that's problematic. Because, and that's where I kind of want to talk about how we react in a community to problematic books. I do not think that a book is only ever just one thing. I do not like how normative discussions on the internet have become. Going back to Harry Potter. For some reason, now that JK Rowling finally seems to forever be properly over, it's not okay anymore to acknowledge the great things that Harry Potter has done for literature. That it was very formative for fandom culture, for YA literature, how we know it now. That it has been incredibly important for so many people among us. And I think books can have harmful content in a way, but yet to us personally, still be incredibly important. And I think for us as private readers, we can say, yes, there is this problematic content in it, and I do in no way agree with that part of the book, but I can still love it very much. But again, us as private readers, I don't think we should use that to talk over the people who want to make us acknowledge the problematic parts of books. And I think it just comes down to having a proper balance between the two, to saying, yes, I love this book. Yes, this book was incredibly important to discovering myself, to the way I grew up, to just my personality as it is. And for example, I think a book can have incredible, for example, white LGBT representation, and as such be incredibly important to a white gay teenager, for example, or a white trans teenager, yet it can still have racist undertones. And I don't think that it's always that one takes away from the other. And so for us, it's important, again, to say, yes, this book was incredibly important to me, maybe in my younger years, maybe now. However, I still hear you, and I still listen to you, and I see you, and I see what you mean, and I see why it might be hurtful to you. And I think that's where we kind of need to land as private readers, that just because something was amazing to us and was incredibly important to us doesn't mean that the problematic in the book doesn't exist. But at the same time, just because the problematic in a book doesn't exist doesn't mean that the amazing in the book and that the amazing that a book did doesn't exist as well. And so that's where I think we as private readers should land. Of course, if you have people like JK Rowling, and if you still want to get to your Harry Potter content, and if you still want to get your, I don't know, whatever content, but the author is still alive, and you don't want to monetarily support that author, there's plenty of ways to get your content without supporting the author directly. You can get your books secondhand, you can get your, I don't know, fan art, fan articles from people on Etsy or wherever, where the money doesn't directly go into J.K. Rowling's pockets. And I do think it's also important for us to look for those ways. But I also don't think that we as, again, private readers completely have to cancel everything to do with a book or story just because there's something problematic about it. But now let me move on to talking about what I see as our responsibility as people who can recommend books to other people we do not know. So our responsibility as book bloggers, as bookstagrammers, as booktubers, just as reviewers in general, as influencers. And our biggest responsibility, in my opinion, is transparency. And I think that generally everything that counts for private reading, I think you still have the right to personally come to a decision to support or not support an author, to support or not support a book. But I think for us as reviewers, it's incredibly important to stay transparent, especially in full reviews. I can understand that it's not always that easy to talk about some things in a wrap-up where you have maybe 1 or 2 minutes to talk about per book, but we should still try our best, in our opinion, even if we gave a book 4 or 5 stars. And I get that it might be scary, and this goes to mostly cis, white, straight booktubers or bookstagrammers or reviewer, obviously. I get that it might be scary to say, I love this book, but it's also problematic because people on the internet are scary, frankly speaking. And we, of course, don't want to be attacked or whatever. But I still think we should not care about that. We should care more about the possibility of a book hurting someone from a marginalized community. Why can we normalize trigger warnings when we talk about books, but not normalize talking about problematic content, which, by the way, in my opinion, should be trigger warnings just as much as talking about, like, yeah, this book has self-harm, this book has rape in it, this book has graphic violence, whatever. I personally, I know I don't perfectly do this always, but I do try my best. Whenever I talk about the Anita Blake series, I talk about how it's my guilty pleasure series that I still kind of just like enjoy reading, even though it's not very good. But that's also a guilty pleasure series because, especially in the earlier books, there is some latent and not so latent homophobia, and there's quite often, frankly speaking, descriptions of especially black characters that are like really, really strange. I have talked about the description a lot of times that in the latest book that I have read, where a black man was described as supposedly looking like he should be hunting lions with a spear in the desert, which, like, there's a lot to unpack here. And so whenever I talk about the series, I do not go out of my way to recommend the series anymore. But when I talk about the series, mostly in the contents of it being a guilty pleasure series of mine, I do talk about that. I do talk that there's misogyny in it, that there's homophobia in it, that there's racism in it. And I don't really care if that makes me seem like a bad person, that I still read this series every now and again, because I think it's more important for me to make you aware that that is in this book, rather than trying to stop me from seeming like I read horrible books. Similarly to other books that I read that I love, the Anita Blake series I don't really love anymore, it's more just a guilty pleasure series, but 2 books that I love that have some problematic stuff in it. The first, I don't think I've ever really talked about that in this series so far, but in this series there's a problematic relationship. There's a relationship in there with a huge age difference where the guy is, I think, double the age of the girl, and I'm not even sure if she was like already over the age of 18 when they got together. And even though it wasn't at the time when the two of them got together, there was a time in that series where there was like a huge power difference between the two of them, and it's still one of my favorite relationships of all time. And I acknowledge that it's incredibly problematic. I actually don't know if it's still one of my favorite relationships of all time, because I've reread book 1 last year and I'm scared to reread book 2 and 3, because the last time I read those books were when I was 14, and obviously I had a very different outlook on relationships and what constitute problematic relationships. I still love Twilight, for fuck's sake, so yeah. I'm kind of scared of rereading the series and kind of having my romantic glasses about the relationship taken off, because the male in that relationship is one of my first fictional crushes ever. But yeah, that was a little bit of a tangent. So I do think it's important to also talk about romantic relationships. And of course with romance, it's different again, because especially within the romance genre, there's kind of two groups of people. One of them is the people who say, no, all romances should always be wholesome and perfect. And the other one is like, it's kinks, it's fantasies. If I want to have my power imbalance relationship, if I want to have my dark romance relationships, then that's completely okay. We're aware that it's just a fantasy and that in real life this would never be okay. So that's like a whole other discussion that I actually don't want to get into, because I'm not a romance reader, so I don't feel like I'm qualified to talk about that. And then the last example of a book where I did talk about that when I reviewed that book is The Testament of Loki by Joanne Harris, which is kind of the sequel to The Gospel of Loki, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And in this book, you have a main character who is kind of possessed by Loki. And that girl has an eating disorder, depression, and I think also self-harm issues. And you have this scene in the book where Loki just like shows her how she actually is and how wonderful she actually is, and suddenly everything's okay. And of course, that's kind of problematic when you talk about it in the content of like mental illness just suddenly being gone and not having to work through mental illness. But then there's also the caveat of like, you literally have a god inside you, like how would that influence it? But I'm still, whenever I talk about this book, I do mention this because I think it's important. I cannot say if it's problematic or not, because I haven't gone through depression, I haven't gone through self-harm, and I haven't gone through an eating disorder. And so I think it's important for us to be transparent about that. And as reviewers, just the same as private readers, there can be times when we do not notice something because we're just not as attuned to certain depictions of certain communities or whatever. However, as reviewers, I think it's even more important to listen to marginalized communities and to listen to what they have to say. And if you hear someone talk about it, then okay, the first time you talked about the book, you didn't mention it, but then mention it the second time you talk about the book. You can say, I still love this book, but I also acknowledge that this is problematic and this isn't okay, and this should change. And I don't understand it. Again, it comes down to like the normativity of things, that things have to be either good or bad. And I think as a reviewer, yes, you can still decide to support an author that you personally think might not have done that great things in the past because you personally believe in second chances, or you personally think an author has changed, which for me is, for example, with Brandon Sanderson, where I'm aware that he has said problematic things in the past, and I have educated myself on what his stances were concerning those things, especially homophobia and transphobia and LGBT issues in the past few years. So I had read most of his books already after I heard that for the first time. And so I went out of my way, because I felt like it was my duty to do that, to go and inform myself what exactly he said. And what I found is that first of all, he has apologized for that, and that second of all, the answers he gave in recent interviews in the past few years about, for example, ways the magic system in, I think, the Cosmere in general can be used for transgender individuals in that world, or the responsibility he feels in properly representing LGBT characters, just makes me still comfortable for now. Because for me with authors, it's always a for now. For now, made me comfortable still buying his books, but also being aware of that he had this stance in the past, and that at least it seems for now that he changed his opinions on those things. And I have decided that yes, I feel comfortable enough talking about his books because they are very important to me, and I will just keep an open eye on what he says in the future and so on. And so I don't know how to end this video properly, to be honest, because in the end it just comes down to being careful. And that's also something that, just a little rant at the end. I do not like how us being sensitive about certain issues, like LGBT people being sensitive about LGBT issues, Black people being sensitive about Black issues, how that has gotten like such a negative connotation. Because to be honest, like if I have a wound, then the skin around that wound is sensitive. And I do not like it if anyone pokes me on my arm there. Someone else, if I poke them on the arm, they might be like, that was like a little bit uncomfortable, but I don't really, it's whatever, I can ignore it. But me who has a wound there, if someone constantly pokes it, or even just once pokes it, then I'm gonna have a way bigger reaction to it. And I think that's okay. I think sensitive doesn't always have to mean having an overreaction to something. And I think that's just something that we have to be aware of. Again, kind of in the same vein of some people being more attuned to certain issues and other people not being as attuned to certain issues. And so yeah, I think this is where I'm going to end this video, to be honest. Just saying that, again, I do not think that there's any completely right decision. I do not think that there's any book that you should or shouldn't read, definitely because of problematic content, but I think the only wrong decision you can make when it comes to problematic books and problematic authors is saying, I don't care. And I do think that that's quite a bit different than saying, yes, I listen to you, yes, I hear you, but I still love the book anyway, despite the problematic content. I think saying I don't care and I won't listen to you, like there's a big difference, even if the end result is the same. But maybe that's just me personally. And so yeah, if you made it through this very long already video, because I've been filming for an hour already, then congrats, I guess. Tell me in the comments down below your thoughts on problematic books and problematic authors. Because again, I think this is just a topic where there's a bunch of kind of right answers, but no really right answer. And if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. Again, I will leave those 2 videos by Jessie Gender on the JK Rowling essay and her tweets down below as well, so go and watch that if you feel like you didn't 100% understand why the essay was problematic and transphobic. And also all the links to Black Lives Matter are also still down in the description box. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!